lavish like Lupe. Leg kicked out like the mama, that's how I shoot fades. Laced up in the box, now we looking like shoestrings. Fofo on my hip, say that he acting odd though. Sawed off under the seat, call it El Chapo. Hoes all over the place, looking like potholes. He dies, then he dies, now I'm sounding like Drago. Always let them bury themselves, that's how you sense fakes. I always aim straight for the head, that's how you kill snakes. Blood all over the place, told you we didn't play. Arms stretched down on the floor, just like Jesus laid. Grain, villains.
All right. Well, I know it's been a long time. And I've actually been trying to get an episode done since the last one, but there's been a lot going on. A lot. Some of it I won't talk about right now, because it doesn't need to be talked about right now. But there's some things in the works that have been going on. So once all that gets done, I'll feel a whole lot better. And I may or may not share it with you guys. And, I've been on myself pretty bad lately because I haven't done episodes. There were a couple days where I could have put one together. But I was like, today is a day you just need to rest. So any rest days I could get, I did. But I kept telling myself, there is no scheduling for this. There are no time frames for this. We're just going to do it whenever. And so that made me feel better. So I had a little downtime at the moment, and I was like, you know what? Let's go ahead and let's get one started, because what are we going on? What was it? Mother's Day, I think, was the last time I released one. So that's been way too long. So welcome to another episode of the Inner Heel Turn podcast. Before we get too deep into all of these things, however you're listening to it, like it, share it, subscribe to it, all of it. Turn on notifications, all of it. Because when we go on a hiatus like I just did, you need to be notified when we make the comeback. And before I get into today's show, a lot has happened, I guess we'll say sports world, since the last time I talked. One of the big things is the Lane Kiffin situation. Which, man, really, to me personally, it's not that big of a deal. And here's why. Because what he said, wow, why did that come out like that? What he said, really, he may be lying, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's not. Because Mississippi, they have a reputation. Now, there's a lot of the stuff that Mississippi is accused for that they've done in the past. Do they still do? Probably not. But living here my whole life, I'm not going to sit here and be stupid about things and lie to you about things. I'm pretty certain that what he said was true. He probably did have some recruits' parents that did not want their kids coming down to Oxford, Mississippi. And I'm not saying Mississippi is a bad place. I'm not. But like I've told people in the past, like a few years back when I was driving Uber, and I would always pick up people and I would take them to the airport. And they would be visiting. There were a lot of them from California. And they always all said the same thing. They was like, oh, it's so beautiful around here. There's just, man, all these trees. This is just amazing. And they would always tell me that they're going to come back. They wanted to come back and visit more of Mississippi. And asked if I had any suggestions. And yes, there are some good places in Mississippi. But I would always tell them, for basically, this is as good as it gets. Oxford. And I've always said it. I will still say it now. And I'm probably one of the people that aren't, that I'm not helping things. But it's kind of true. 95, that 95 might be a high number, but we'll go with 90 to 95% of things. This is what I would tell them, that you hear about Mississippi, they're pretty much true. I mean, we can say I'm lying all we want, but is Mississippi still a racist state? There's still a lot of old people in Mississippi who grew up in those times and who still think the same way they did back in the 50s, 60s. And a high majority of their kids think and feel the same way. Just being honest about it. Would I love for it not to be that way? Of course. I would love for Mississippi not to have that reputation and for that not to be true. But it is. We can't lie about it. We got to be honest about it. Still, I wouldn't leave. Even though when I was younger, I said I was leaving Mississippi, but I'm not. But there's too many small towns that are still just, for example, Holly Springs. That's where I grew up. You go there now, it's basically the black side of town and the white side of town. Anybody who lives there will tell you that. Anybody who's been around there will tell you that. And that's a lot of the small towns in Mississippi still in 2026. The only problem I had with the whole Lane Kiffin comment is I've seen a lot of people reacting to it, and they basically just said what I said. Oh, it's true, so I don't know why everybody's so mad about it, about what he said. He shouldn't have to apologize for it, and all this and that. My issue with the whole comment about Ole Miss, after he's been gone, think about it, like him, don't like him, whatever. My only issue with his comment was nobody asked him anything about recruiting or about what LSU looks like compared to Ole Miss. The person who wrote the article has come out and said this when asked about Kiffin's comments. He said it just come out of nowhere. Lane was just talking, and then he started saying that. Nobody asked him. That's the issue I have. Nobody even asked you. So why are you still trying to throw the dirt? Throw the shade? But I think that's another episode for another time. So we should get into this episode, which is it's a little late, because about the time all that was happening with Kiffin, Antonio Brown was on social media, and he was Well, he was losing his mind again on social media, and with rants and all kind of outrageous things. But it got me to thinking, because we just finished the 5-part series, and I was then at a point of which direction is the show going to go. And anytime I've been hung up on which direction am I trying to go, what do I need to talk about, what do I want to get together, well, lo and behold, something happens. And Antonio Brown, being Antonio Brown, was the answer I needed. So I did some research, and I came up with some stuff. So that's what this show is going to be about. And it's basically the unraveling of Antonio Brown. Mental health, trauma, and basically is the longest fall from grace in NFL history, possibly. So let's get it started, all right? I've been here long enough, just chit-chatting about nothing. Me telling everybody who's listening how much I missed you guys. But I want you to close your eyes for a second. I mean it. If you're driving, obviously, I want you to keep them open. But just picture this in your mind. Picture MetLife Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. It's January the 2nd, 2022. And it seems like it's been longer than that. But it's in the middle of the third quarter, and the Buccaneers are playing the New York Jets. And the Buccaneers are losing. The defending Super Bowl champions, a team led by Tom Brady, is getting beat by the New York Jets. A franchise that has not won a Super Bowl since 1969. When Richard Nixon was president and the internet was still a science fiction concept. The Jets are winning. The stadium has a nervous, weird energy, though. The cameras keep cutting to Brady on the sideline with his helmet on, jaw tight, watching the offense try to find something. And then something happens on the sideline that no one in the stadium was fully prepared for. Something that nobody watching at home, even the most seasoned NFL viewers, the ones who had been watching this league for 30 or 40 years, none of them was prepared for. Antonio Brown, number 81, one of the most decorated wide receivers in the history of football, a man who, at his peak, I mean, you could speak his name in the same breath as Jerry Rice at his peak. A man who had been to 7 Pro Bowls and won 4 consecutive first-team All-Pro selections. A man who had just 6 months earlier been holding a Super Bowl trophy on his home field in Tampa Bay. That man stands on the sideline, and he takes off his helmet. He sets it down, and then he takes off his shoulder pads. Right there on the sideline, in the middle of a live NFL game. In front of his teammates, in front of his coaches, in front of 46,000 people in the building, and millions more watching on Fox. He removes his shoulder pads, and then the jersey comes off too. Number 81, Antonio Brown, pulls that jersey over his head, and then, as if to make absolute certain that no one thinks this is an accident, as if to make absolutely certain that no one in the world mistakes this for anything other than what it is, he takes the jersey and the gloves and he throws them straight into the stands, into the crowd. He gives them away in a game in the third quarter. And then he walks to the back of the end zone, shirtless. Antonio Brown, 33 years old, one of the best football players who ever lived, is standing shirtless in the New York Jets end zone in January, and he starts running. Not panicking, not walking urgently, running with a little hop to his step. He raises his arms, he waves to the crowd. He is waving like a man who just won something, like a man taking a victory lap, like a man who is free. He is smiling. He waves at the camera. He waves at the fans. He waves at nobody and everybody all at once. And then he jogs through the end zone and disappears into the tunnel, and he's gone. Now, his teammate, Mike Evans, who, if you don't know, he's a large, powerful man who himself is one of the best receivers in football. He sees what's happening, and he chases him. He physically tries to grab him. He tries to stop him, but he cannot because Brown is gone. Tom Brady watches from the field, and Brady, who's seen everything. I mean, he's won 7 Super Bowls. He come back from the 28-3 deficit. He's played more championship games than most franchises. He stands on the field and watches this happen with the look of a man who has just been punched in the stomach by something he did not see coming. He looks stunned, genuinely stunned. The broadcast team, they go quiet for a moment. Then they try to explain what just happened. They can't fully do it because there isn't a clean explanation for what just happened. So after the game, while the Buccaneers, they won, because of course they did. That's how this story goes. And plus it's the Jets. Head coach Bruce Arians walks up to the microphone in the post-game press conference. He's asked about Antonio Brown, and Bruce says, with the flat authority of a man who has made a decision and is done discussing it, he is no longer a Buccaneer. That's the end of the story. That is the end of the story. I still cannot believe that that was just 4 years ago. Now, about an hour after the game ends, while Brady is probably still in the locker room cooling down, while Arians is still answering questions, while NFL Twitter is in complete meltdown, Antonio Brown posts on his social media. It's not an apology, not an explanation, not a statement from his agent. He just posts 2 words. Super Gremlin. That's it. Super Gremlin. That's the punctuation mark on one of the most surreal moments in NFL sideline history. Not a press conference, not a tearful explanation, not even a clue. Just Super Gremlin. Now, y'all know what this show is, if you've listened before. This is the inner heel turn. We don't do hot takes here. We don't do simple narratives. We don't do Antonio Brown is crazy and call it a day because that's the easy thing to say. That's what everybody says. And if everybody is saying the easy thing, then I know for a fact that nobody has actually looked at this story. Not really. And not from the beginning. Not from Miami, 1988. Not from the house he grew up in and the father who left and the streets that shaped him. Not from the neurological science of what happens to a brain that absorbs contact for 20 plus years. Not from the psychology of a man raised in absence and poverty who built an empire out of sheer obsessive will and then watched it dissolved. So today, and I'm telling you right now, this one's going to be a long one. I think I got my groove on these long ones. But it's going to be thorough. So get comfortable, get your drink, charge your phone up. Today we're going to answer the question that we all have been sitting with since January 2nd, 2022. You probably didn't even know you were sitting with this question, but you've been sitting with it just along with me. How does one of the greatest receivers in NFL history, a man who was genuinely on pace to be mentioned alongside Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, as the best to ever do it, how does that man in his career shirtless at MetLife Stadium, waving at strangers before disappearing into a tunnel and posting Super Gremlin? If he played for the Jets, then all your questions are answered. But that question right there is the entire episode. That is what we are here to answer. And I promise you, we are going to get there, but we're going to do it right. So settle in. This is the inner heel turn. So let's go. The numbers don't lie. What Antonio Brown was. Before we go anywhere, before we talk about a single incident, before we bring up a single controversy, before I say a single word about what went wrong, I need you to understand what Antonio Brown was. Not was in a dismissive past tense way. Was in the sense of, this is the foundation. This is what we are working with. Because if you don't have the foundation right, you cannot understand the fall. You need to know how high he was standing before you can appreciate how far down he went. So let's talk about the numbers, okay? 928 receptions, 12,291 receiving yards, 83 touchdowns. Those are Antonio Brown's career statistics. But let me give you some context on those numbers. Those numbers put him in the top 15 wide receivers in NFL history by receptions, by yards, by every major metric that matters at the position. He is not only fringe of all-time greatness, he is planted firmly in the middle of it. Now, let me get more specific with it, because the overall numbers are one thing, but the sustained excellence is another thing entirely. And this is what makes the Antonio Brown story unique. From 2013 to 2018, 6 consecutive seasons, Antonio Brown never had fewer than 101 receptions in a single year. He never had fewer than 1,284 receiving yards. 6 straight seasons in a league that punishes wide receivers with injuries, with scheme changes, with quarterback inconsistency, with defensive coordinators who devote entire game plans to take you away. Brown was an annual force of nature for 6 consecutive years. Name me the other receivers who have done that at that level of sustained dominance. You can't. Nobody has. Not in that era. Not at that clip. Not with those numbers year after year after year. He made 6 consecutive Pro Bowls from 2013 to 2018. 6. That's not a fluke. That is not being in the right system at the right time. That is a body of work that speaks for itself. He earned 4 consecutive first-team All-Pro selections from 2014 to 2017. And to get a first-team All-Pro selection, you have to be the best at your position in the entire National Football League in that calendar year. Not one of the best, the best. And he did it 4 years in a row. And going through a lot of these stats, I forgot. I remembered, but it wasn't until I looked, I was like, wow, that he did help me win a couple fantasy football championships. I do appreciate him for that. And then there's 2015, okay? I want to talk about 2015 because 2015 is one for the archive. 136 receptions, 1,734 receiving yards. Wait a minute, I'm reading that right. Let me double check. Actually, 1,834 yards. 1,834 receiving yards in a single season. To this day, that remains one of the single greatest individual receiving seasons in NFL history. Even with the extra game they've added, that's still one of the tops. He was not just the best receiver in football in 2015. He was playing at a level that made the entire conversation around wide receiver excellence need to be recalibrated. Wow. People were generally asking, could this man sustain this? Is this a new baseline for what's possible at the position? He was named to the NFL 2010's All-Decade Team. He won a Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in February of 2021. He ranks, depending on which analytical system you use, as somewhere between the 5th and 9th greatest wide receiver in NFL history. Former Pittsburgh Steelers general manager Kevin Colbert, a man who built championship rosters for 2 decades, was asked about Brown's Hall of Fame case after his retirement from the game. And Colbert said, and I want to quote this directly, that Brown's Hall of Fame case can't even be debated. It can't even be debated from the man who spent years watching him up close, building a team around him. Now, I want to do something that I think will hit harder than just reading statistics. Let me talk to y'all about what it felt like to watch Antonio Brown play football. Because there were great receivers in Brown's era. Now, I don't get me wrong, because I know when I started saying all that about him in the same breath with Jerry Rice and all this and that, I know a lot of y'all listening was like, well, you started rambling off names too. So, we'll go over those. Calvin Johnson, Megatron. He was a physical specimen, unlike anything the sport had ever produced. 6'5", 236 pounds. A wide receiver with the body of a tight end and the hands of a surgeon. Calvin Johnson was otherworldly. Larry Fitzgerald, one of the most elegant and complete receivers in the history of the position. A man who played forever with grace and professionalism and racked up numbers that would never look like their age. Dez Bryant, the Cowboy superstar who at his peak was an electric, physical, dominant weapon who made opposing secondaries look like they'd never played football before. All great, all Hall of Fame caliber, all legitimate legends of the game. But Antonio Brown was different. And I want to explain how. Because I know you're saying, you're disagreeing. I know. Just sit back and wait. Brown was not the biggest receiver on the field. He was not the fastest receiver on the field. Not in terms of raw 40-yard dash speed. He was not the most physically imposing. He was 5'11", 185 pounds. In NFL terms, he was not a physical freak. What he was a technician, a craftsman, a man who had decided at some point in his development as a player that nobody on earth was going to outwork him, and that through sheer obsessive preparation, he was going to become the best route runner the world had ever seen. His routes were art, legitimate art. He had a degree of precision in his cuts, the crispness of a comeback route, the explosiveness out of a double move, the way he could sit down in a zone coverage and find the soft spot in a defense that was almost mechanical in its perfection. Cornerbacks who lined up against him would talk afterward about how he ran a route one way, gave them an indication of where he was going, and then was somewhere else entirely. He didn't just beat corners, he made them look like they never practiced. And the preparation, let me talk about the preparation for a second, because this is critical to understanding the full Antonio Brown story. He was obsessive, famously legendary, obsessively dedicated to his craft. He was the first one in the building in the morning and the last one to leave at night. And former teammates talk about watching him run the same route over and over and over and over again until it was perfect. Not until it was good, not until he felt comfortable, until it was perfect. He did ballet to improve his footwork. He traveled to France for chirotherapy recovery sessions. He hired personal trainers and coaches beyond what the team provided. He was a man for whom greatness was not enough. He needed to know why he was great. And he needed to refine that greatness until there was no more room for refinement. That kind of obsessive preparation does not come from a healthy, comfortable place. It comes from somewhere desperate. It comes from someone who at a fundamental level cannot afford to stop working, because stopping means thinking, and thinking means feeling, and feeling means confronting something painful. But we'll get to that. We'll absolutely get to that. Now, the end zone celebrations, y'all remember those? Brown had a different celebration practically every week. He did the twerk, He did the Irish jig. He did dances that required actual choreography, not just spiking the ball or pointing to the sky, but full sequences of movement that clearly took thought and practice. The league fined him for some of them. He paid fines and kept celebrating. And what I remember about watching those celebrations, what I think a lot of people who watched him in his prime remember, was that they were joyful, genuinely, infectiously joyful. There was something about the way Brown celebrated that made you feel like you were watching a man who was truly, completely happy in those moments. Like the touchdown was everything. Like that was what life was for. And maybe it was. Maybe for Antonio Brown, those moments in the end zone, the ball catching, the celebration, the roar of the crowd, were the only moments when everything was quiet inside his head. The only moments when he felt completely whole. Because here's what I know, and I want to say this clearly before we go any further, before we talk about what went wrong, and we're going to go deep on what went wrong. You need to understand how extraordinary this man was. Not pretty good, extraordinary. Not one of the best of his era, extraordinary. Legitimately, historically, one of the greatest to ever play the most difficult skill position in professional football. And as I wrote that, I laughed. Of course, quarterbacks above it. But anyway, if none of the chaos had happened, if Antonio Brown had been a different person, if his life had given him different materials to work with, we would be talking about him right now as a first ballot Hall of Famer, possibly the greatest wide receiver of the modern era, perhaps even having a conversation about where he sits relative to Jerry Rice on the all-time list. That's not crazy, really. The numbers support it. The tape supports it. The people who played with him and coached him support it. He was that good. And that is why this story is so heartbreaking, because the greater you were, the longer you fall feels. And Antonio Brown had one of the longest falls of the of the highest places in NFL history. So let's start from the beginning of that story. Not the NFL, not Pittsburgh. Let's go all the way back. Let's go to Miami. But before we go all the way back to Miami, do you like to travel? Well, if you do, then stop getting played like everybody else. Because retail travel's been working you for years and charging full prices while laughing behind the curtain. But at LNS Travel, their wholesale travel service flips the whole script. You get unlimited trips, 5-star hotels at 2-star prices, over 1 million weekly stays for pennies on the dollar. And this isn't a discount. This is the cheat code the big sites hope you never find. Turn your life into a highlight reel of ridiculous experiences without breaking the bank. Travel smarter, travel more, pay less, the Hill way. So text "Show Me" in your name to 844-524-5425. Once again, "Show Me" in your name to 844-524-5425. All right. I had to we got to give a shout out to our peoples. And our peoples over at LNS Travel, they're our peoples. So y'all need to go holler at them. So, the Miami roots. He was born into chaos. July the 10th, 1988, Miami, Florida, Antonio Brown is born. Now, I want you to understand something about Miami in 1988 because the city matters. Miami in the late 80s and through the 90s is not the Miami of luxury condos and the influencer beach content. Miami in 1988, especially the parts of Miami that Antonio Brown grew up in, is a city in the middle of a crisis. The crack cocaine epidemic is dismantling communities. Gun violence is everywhere. The poverty areas of Miami, and Miami has some of the most concentrated poverty of any major city in America, are places where children grow up with violence as a backdrop, where shootouts are not a movie thing, where you might hear gunfire the way other kids hear traffic, where the question is not whether you know someone who's been shot, but how many people you know. And into that city, into that environment, Antonio Brown is born. Now, here's the first layer of this story that I think most casual sports fans either don't know or don't fully appreciate. Antonio Brown's father, his biological father, the man who was supposed to be the primary male figure in his life, is not some random guy. His father is Eddie Touchdown Brown. And if you follow the NFL, you may know that name. Eddie Brown was a wide receiver for the Cincinnati Bengals from 1985 to 1991. He played in Super Bowl 23. He won NFL Offensive Rookie of the Year in 1985. He was a first-round draft pick, and after his NFL career, he became arguably the greatest player in the history of the Arena Football League, an absolute legend of the indoor game, a man who holds AFL records and wore AFL championships, and was such a dominant force in that league that they named things after him. Eddie Brown was a legitimate football legend. He could throw the ball to his son and say, "I know what greatness looks like. I've lived it." He could have been a teacher, a guide, a living example. He could have been everything to Antonio. Instead, when Antonio was 16, Eddie Brown left. He chose football. He chose the Arena Football League. He chose his career, the Albany Firebirds, the cheering crowds, the game that had always given him purpose, over his son. He walked out of Antonio's life at 16. At the exact moment when a boy needs a father most, at the exact moment when the world starts to get complicated, when identity starts to form, when the questions of who you are and what you're worth start becoming urgent, Eddie Brown left. And I want to be careful here because I'm not here to vilify Eddie Brown. He made his choices and he lives with them. There are two sides of every family story, and I'm only telling you one of them. But from Antonio's perspective, from the perspective of a child who was left, this is the defining event. The before and after, the thing everything else connects to. Antonio's mother, Adrienne Moss, is left to raise Antonio and his younger brother Desmond as a single mother. In Miami, in poverty, as a single mother in poverty, in one of the most difficult cities in America to be in poverty, she eventually remarries to a Hollywood film director named Larry Moss. And you would think, okay, a stepfather, another male figure, maybe this helps, maybe this gives Antonio some stability. But Brown has described his relationship with his stepfather as one that didn't fine-tune very well. That's a diplomatic way of saying it was difficult. Reports and Brown's own account suggest that the friction between Antonio and his stepfather, the tension in that blended household, was severe enough that Antonio, at some point in his teenage years, essentially left. He stopped living at home. He was couch surfing with teammates, staying with friends, families, finding his own way in Miami at an age when most kids are worried about curfew and homework. 16 years old, father gone, stepfather relationship fractured, sleeping wherever he can. Now, Brown has talked about his upbringing in ways that are both matter-of-fact and heartbreaking. On the Carissa Please podcast, and I want to make sure I'm quoting this accurately because it's important. Brown said, and I quote, "You know how it is being from Miami? People don't really show us the love that we desire. Obviously, we grow up in the fast life, the poverty areas. So it was always gun violence and drug violence." He was not being dramatic, and he was not performing. He was describing what was normal for him growing up. Shootouts were normal. Drug violence was normal. The fast life, meaning the life where you move quick, stay alert, trust no one too much because the streets don't forgive slowness, or that's what the environment he came up in. And then he said something that I think is one of the most insightful things Brown has ever said publicly. He said those traumas, the gun violence, the poverty, the fast life, shape our perspective in the world. Not shaped past tense, but shape present tense. because they never stop shaping. You know, the things that happen to you as a child, they just don't form memories. They form the lens through which you see everything that comes after. They form your threat detection system. They form your understanding of safety and danger. And they form your ability or your inability to trust. Now, I want to bring in some psychology here because I think this is where most sports media fails. They see Antonio Brown's behavior and they say he's crazy or he's a diva or he's selfish, and they leave it there. But if you actually study the science of what happens to children who grow up with adverse childhood experiences, and there's a whole framework around this, the ACE study, which is adverse childhood experiences, you start to understand something much more complex. Children who experience poverty, parental abandonment, witnessing community violence, housing instability, family dysfunction, these experiences do not just create bad memories, they literally rewire the developing brain. The part of your brain that detects threats and sounds the alarm, it becomes hyperactive in children who grow up in chronic threat environments. Because in those environments, being hypervigilant keeps you safe. Looking at every person who walks towards you and asking, is this a threat, keeps you alive. Reacting fast, reacting hard, not hesitating, that's survival. But that same brain response doesn't turn off when you leave Miami. It doesn't turn off when you make the NFL, and it doesn't turn off when you sign a $40 million contract. It goes with you. And in an NFL locker room or a team meeting or a front office negotiation, that hyper-vigilant threat response, the one that served you perfectly on the streets of Miami, looks like paranoia, looks like aggression, looks like someone who can't handle authority or criticism or being passed over for an award. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, for rational decision making, for the ability to pause before you act, develops differently in children raised in chronic stress and trauma. It literally develops differently, which means that for someone like Antonio Brown, the gap between feeling something and acting on that feeling is genuinely, neurologically smaller than it is for someone who grew up in a stable, safe environment. Not as an excuse, as a fact, as a scientific fact about human brain development. And then there's the father piece. And I want to spend some time on this because I think this is the most important psychological thread in the entire Antonio Brown story. His father, Eddie Brown, was a professional football player, a wide receiver, a man celebrated for his athletic gifts, his flashiness, his scoring ability. Touchdown Brown, they called him. And Eddie chose that. The nickname, the game, the adoration of crowds over his son. Antonio Brown grew up to become a professional football player, a wide receiver, a man celebrated for his athletic gifts, his flashiness, his scoring ability. He wore his father's position like a second skin, and he became obsessed, genuinely, almost pathologically obsessed with being told he was the best, with being validated, with being seen. Now, is that a coincidence? You tell me. You tell me whether it's a coincidence that a boy abandoned by a famous football player for a football field grows up to dedicate his entire life to being great at football. You tell me whether it's a coincidence that a man whose father left without ever telling him he was enough spends the rest of his life demanding to be told he is enough. You tell me. Psychologists have a name for this pattern. They call it validation addiction. The compulsive need to receive external affirmation of your worth because the internal sense of worth was never properly formed. Children whose parents, especially their fathers in cases like this, leave without providing that foundation. You are worthy, you are loved, you are enough. That message. Often spend the rest of their lives chasing that message from other sources, from coaches, from teammates, from crowds, from award votes, from contract negotiations. And the terrible irony is that no amount of external validation ever actually fills the hole, because The whole is not shaped like a Pro Bowl selection or a team MVP award. It is shaped like a specific person in a specific moment, saying something that person never said. Antonio Brown's father left when he was 16. Eddie Brown never said you are enough. And for the next 2+ decades, Antonio Brown chased that feeling on every football field he ever stepped onto. He chased it with every route he ran and every touchdown he scored and every celebration he choreographed. He chased it in the numbers. Look at these numbers. Look at what I did. Look at what I built out of nothing. Look at me. Dad, look at me. Let me also tell you about the practical reality of his teenage years, because this is not metaphorical. This is concrete. Brown attended Miami Norland High School. He was a football player, and he was actually quite good. He was named North Athlete of the Year at the Miami-Dade Gridiron Classic in 2005. He had ability, he had talent, he was being noticed. But the academic piece was always challenging. And whether that was the chaos of his home life, the instability of couch surfing, the energy it takes to survive in a poverty environment, that leaves very little bandwidth for studying, whatever the combination of reasons. Brown did not meet the academic requirements to play at Florida State University, which had recruited him. FSU passed. He enrolled instead at Florida International University on a scholarship in 2007. And then in February of 2007, he lost that scholarship too. There was an altercation involving security at the school. Details vary, but it's depending on who's telling the story. But the result was the same. FIU took away the scholarship. Antonio Brown, at 18 years old, had now been rejected by one major program and expelled effectively from another. He had no scholarship. He had no obvious path to college football. He had grown up without stable housing, without a father, with a difficult stepfather situation, and one of the most violent environments in America. And here's where I want to say something important, even at this point. Before the NFL money, before the fame, before the success, Antonio Brown was already in a recurring pattern of conflict with institutions, with authority, with the organizations that had rules and structures he was expected to follow. Was that the streets of Miami written on his DNA? Was it a boy who had never had a consistent authority figure to model healthy responses to authority after? Or was it something deeper? Now, I don't think there's a clear answer to that question, but I do think the question needs to be asked, because the pattern starts here, long before the Steelers or the Raiders or the Patriots. Long before any of that. The pattern starts in Miami with a teenage kid who has no father, no permanent home, and a recurring habit of colliding with the structures that are supposed to give his life shape. And that kid, that Miami kid, broke and homeless and scholarship-less and 18 years old, is about to pick up a phone and cold call a college football coach and talk his way into the next chapter of his life. Because this is also who Antonio Brown is. Don't ever forget that. The resilience, the grit, the refusal to accept that the story is over. That is in him too. It was always in him too. Now, when setting out to record this, I did not envision or anticipate another multi-part series like we just finished. But as I dug and researched and basically got the layout of how I was going to go with everything and started actually recording it, which is taking longer than anticipated and having to get that motivation back, I see that there will be another multi-part series, and this will be on Antonio Brown and the whole situation. So, with that being said, we're going to end everything right here for part 1. And we will start part 2 very soon. And I'm going to try to have all of this released, like, I want to say, like, over a few days period, not once a week. Because it's been way too long since I've done this anyway. So with all that being said, this has been the Inner Heel Turn podcast. Thank you for riding with me on this one. It's going to be long. It's going to be heavy. And I'm probably going to ask a lot out of you for just listening to it. So don't miss a single episode on this. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a review in the platform that lets you, and tell a friend. I'd like to say we go deep on this show because the shallow version of these stories, they're not good enough. And the shallow version isn't honest. And the honest version, the complicated, infuriating, heartbreaking, occasional funny, always human honest version is the only one worth telling. And we're out.